Hi, everyone. Welcome. Just going to wait a few seconds while everybody joins us online. Thank you for being here today. I see some familiar names. It's nice that you're all here today. Wonderful. So thank you so much for joining us for our webinar, Building Capacity, Dementia Research with Ethno-racial Communities, which is hosted by Dr. Carrie McAiney and Navjot Gill. My name is Emma Bender. I'm the project manager of the Murray Alzheimer Research and Education Program at the Schlegel-UW Research Institute for Aging, or the RIA. So I'd like to start our webinar off by acknowledging the land that we at the RIA occupy. We work on the traditional territory of the Attawandaron, Anishinaabe, and Haudenosaunee peoples. The RIA is situated on the Haldimand Tract, the land promised to the Six Nations that includes 6 miles on each side of the Grand River. As I reflected on this land acknowledgement, I thought about what I've learned about cultural humility from working on this project, which is a topic that Carrie and Navjot are going to dive into more, and also how I can apply those principles to further reconciliation. I recognize that dynamics of power and privilege have led to my occupation of this land, as well as expulsion and harm of Indigenous peoples during the time of settlement and Confederation and since as well. I also recognize that there is much that I don't know, and commit to doing the learning and self-reflection about the history of Indigenous people in Canada, and how I can do more to support reconciliation. We're just going to take a brief moment of silence now for all of you to reflect on the land where you live and work today, if you'd like to do that. There are a few items that I'd like to cover briefly before we get into today's webinar. So first, as you were notified when you joined, this webinar is being recorded. So you will receive an email letting you know when the recording is available. As well, the chat function has been adjusted for this webinar, so messages in the chat will only go to myself and my co-host Dana as well, who's helping out behind the scenes. So please use that to let us know if you're having any tech issues or if you have any concerns. Dana is also monitoring the question and answer box, which you can access in the meeting control panel. That's just at the bottom of your screen, and there's a photo of what that looks like. So feel free to use either of those anytime throughout the presentation, and there will be a question and answer period at the end of the webinar. So first, I'd just like to share a little bit about the Schlegel-UW Research Institute for Aging, or the RIA, as we like to call it. We are a charitable nonprofit foundation, and as a nonprofit organization, our mission is to enhance care and quality of life for older adults through partnerships in research, education, and practice. The RIA supports research and explores aging across various topics, including dementia, technology, culture change, nutrition, heart health, and spirituality. We also engage with stakeholders and partners throughout the research process and use research findings to co-design resources, programs, education, and training. Ultimately, we inform practice and policy change to enhance quality of life for older adults everywhere. Now, before I turn it over to them, I also want to tell you a little bit about our speakers. So Navjot Gill is a Ph.D. candidate in public health at the University of Waterloo, specializing in aging health and well-being. She's also the Cultural Communities Coordinator at the Alzheimer's Society of Alberta and Northwest Territories, where she focuses on raising dementia awareness and improving access to dementia care in diverse communities. Her research examines culturally inclusive care practices and enhanced support services for South Asian Canadians living with dementia and their care partners. Thanks so much for being here. And we also have Carrie McAiney with us. She is an associate professor in the School of Public Health Sciences at the University of Waterloo and Schlegel Research Chair in Dementia and scientific director of the Murray Alzheimer Research and Education Program at the RIA. She also leads the Forward with Dementia project in Canada. Carrie's research involves working in partnership with persons living with dementia, family care partners, providers, and organizations to co-design and evaluate interventions to enhance well-being among persons living with dementia and care partners. So I will turn it over to our speakers now.
Great. Thanks so much, Emma. And thanks to everybody for joining us today. We really appreciate you taking the time out of your days just to spend some time with us and hopefully to do some learning. So before we jump into the presentation, I just wanted to make some comments about the term ethno-racial community because it might be one that you're less familiar with. So this term, ethno-racial community, it incorporates two aspects. So first, ethnicity, which refers to the shared culture, history, language, and ancestry of a group, while race really stands for the shared physical traits amongst a group, and that can include things like skin color. And so sometimes these terms, ethnicity and race, are used interchangeably, but they are different and unique. And when they're used together, I think that they represent a broader group of characteristics among individuals that we might be making reference to. And so I'll be talking about the Dementia and Diversity Steering Committee that we established a little bit later in the presentation. And that steering committee, we had discussions about terminology, and we decided that we wanted to use the term ethno-racial in the work that we're doing. So we'll be doing that, and we'll be using that term going forward today. Next slide. So in terms of the presentation, our aim is to really introduce you to a new resource that's been developed called the Inclusive Research Guidebook, partnering with people living with dementia from ethno-racial communities. So I'll start by providing a little bit of background information as to why we developed this resource, and then talk about the process we undertook to develop the guidebook. And then I'll turn it over to Navjot, who will go over the content, some of the content from the guidebook, and do some reflecting on her own experiences as well. And then we'll have, as Emma mentioned, a Q&A at the end. So as many of you likely know, Canada is one of the most ethno-racially diverse countries in the world. And so in a recent census, 1 in 5 people identified as being foreign-born, and 1 in 5 also identified as being visible minority. So as you can imagine, the Canadian population is becoming more and more diverse. It's probably not surprising or seems quite likely that the population or group of people who are living with dementia in Canada is also becoming more and more diverse as well. Next. So right now, there are about 730,000 people in Canada who are living with dementia. And these numbers are supposed to projected to increase over the next number of years. So by 2030, so in just about 5 years, it's expected to be around 1 million people living with dementia in Canada. And then by 2050, that number is supposed to increase to about 1.7 million. And so while we're learning more and more about dementia and the experiences of people living with dementia in Canada, we really know very little about people that are from different ethno-racial communities who are living with dementia and what their experiences are like. And so because of this, we often will need to look to other countries to learn a little bit more. Next slide. So this includes looking to other countries for, understanding whether there might be differences in the number of people who develop dementia. And so we're able to look at what are called incidence rates, which are really just the number of new cases of dementia that develop. And when we look at research primarily from the US and also from the UK, what it says is that there seems to be higher rates, so more cases of dementia that develop among the Black community or African American community. Among the Asian and Asian American communities, there seems to be maybe lower rates or fewer cases of dementia that are developing, while the white and Latin American communities seem to have fairly similar rates. So again, these are data from the UK and the US primarily. We don't really have data in Canada. There's some preliminary information that suggests maybe the number of new cases that develop is a little bit higher in Black Canadians as well, but again, that needs to be confirmed. Next slide. So why is this important? And so it's important for us to understand the number of people and sort of the distribution of people from different communities, because it impacts other aspects of dementia care. So we know from other research that individuals in some ethno-racial communities might be less likely to receive a diagnosis of dementia. And when you don't have a diagnosis, you may also not be accessing services and supports that can be of assistance. And there's many different reasons why people might not have a diagnosis or be less likely to get one. So for example, there might be language barriers, meaning that it's harder to communicate what's happening and sharing information about symptoms that people might be experiencing. In the community, there might be a lack of awareness or understanding of dementia and what dementia is. Many of the tools that are used by physicians and other healthcare providers to assess dementia are generally not culturally appropriate. And so we may be missing things and not really, the assessments might not be as accurate as they could be. And then as well, there can be different cultural perspectives or perceptions of dementia. So in some cultures, dementia is seen as a normal part of aging. And so if a person in that culture, if there's some changes that are happening, the family might be a little bit less likely to ask about what those changes are and reach out for support. In other communities, dementia may be seen more as a mental illness, or maybe caused by some spiritual or other type of entity. And as a result, there can be quite a bit of stigma that exists and shame that comes from that, making people reluctant to reach out for help. Next slide. So the Alzheimer's Society of Canada, a couple of years ago, has undertaken a study called the Landmark Study. And this is really, they call it a microsimulation, which means that they've taken information at a particular point in time and then used it to project or estimate what the impact of dementia is going to be over the next 30 years. So the first report in the Landmark Study really looked at the numbers, like what are we expecting in terms of the increasing numbers of people living with dementia over the next 30 years. And then the second report, which is called The Many Faces of Dementia in Canada, they looked at different subpopulations and including how the numbers of people within those different subpopulations, how that might change over time. Next. So this is a table that's basically been taken from that second report. And what it does is just tries to give a sense of the the population right now, or in 2020, so if you looked at all of the individuals living with dementia in 2020, and sort of what their background is or how they identify, we see that of all those cases, of all those people, about 65% were from a European background and about 21% from a Canadian background. Much smaller numbers, so about just under 8% were from an Asian background, and that included both East Asian and South Asian. And less than 2% were from a Black background or an Indigenous background. Now, with this landmark study, they looked forward to try and see, well, what might we expect this population to look like in 2050? And so if we were looking at all of the people in 2020 that had dementia, a lower percentage would be from or have a European background or a Canadian background. You can see those decreases. But the number is expected to increase quite substantially in some of the other populations, and in particular in the Asian population. So there's some shifting that's happening, and it's important to understand this because we want to make sure that we know about the experiences of these individuals so that we can make sure the services and supports we have are really going to meet their needs. Next slide. So that gives you a sense of some of the numbers and the projections that are expected over the next couple of decades. But it's really important as well and to listen to people who have lived experience, so individuals who are living with dementia and what they're saying and the changes that they are identifying. So as part of this work, we were provided with an essay that was written by a person who lives with dementia, who's part of an ethno-racial community. And it really was something that inspired the work that we had done and really gave great meaning to sort of the numbers and some of the research activities that we were doing. It puts a human face on it. And so we've just pulled out 2 excerpts from this essay, and we wanted to share those with you. So first, dementia, it seems, is a great equalizer. It touches lives without discrimination. But beneath its all-encompassing nature, I can't help but feel that my experiences as a person of color are sometimes overlooked. Dementia doesn't discriminate, but society does. And the unique intersections of my identity and this condition create a picture that researchers should attempt to comprehend. So this really speaks to that uniqueness that exists and the need to really understand that uniqueness. Next. My plea is for researchers to recognize the delicate balance between my racial or ethnic identity and dementia. Consider how factors like my cultural background affect my journey through this condition, from the unique caregiving dynamics within my family to the accessibility of healthcare resources for my specific needs. So again, this really speaks to that it's not just that the individuals have these unique experiences, they have impacts on how they live and the care that they receive. Next. So the Many Faces of Dementia report really did highlight the need for conducting more research on these subpopulations. So us at the Murray Alzheimer Research and Education Program at the RIA, we thought, well, there's such little research that's been done in Canada. The gap is so big. Maybe we should undertake a process where we identify research priorities in this area of dementia and ethno-racial diversity. And so we decided that we would undertake a Delphi study. And that's a process where it's for building consensus on what the research priorities might be. So that was our original aim, to identify some research priorities. And what we did was establish a steering committee. And the steering committee included people living with dementia, care partners, health and social care providers from different ethno-racial communities. And so we established that committee and said, this is what we wanted to do. And they said, hold on, before you do any research in this area, researchers need to understand how to work with diverse communities. And so we decided as a group that we needed to shift our priorities. Next, please. And have a new aim. And that aim was really to develop a resource to support researchers in conducting research with diverse communities. And so that's then the path we started to go down. Next. So I'm going to just give you a quick overview of the process we took to develop this guidebook, because that was the product we decided upon in the end. So first, what we did was we looked to see, is there already something out there that exists that combines dementia, ethno-racial diversity, and research? And we weren't able to find anything. And so then what we did was worked with the steering committee to determine, okay, if we had a resource for this guidebook, what are the things that should be included? And then what specifically in each of those chapters do we want to include in the guidebook? And so we went through an iterative process back and forth with the steering committee to develop the content in the first draft of the guidebook. We then held a symposium, a Dementia and Diversity Symposium. And the main aim of that symposium was to get feedback on this draft guidebook. And so what we did was we had a World Cafe type of process where groups of people would be reviewing the content and providing feedback. And we got a lot of feedback. It was fantastic, but it was a lot of feedback to receive. Next, please. So then the next step was to really work to incorporate that feedback. And again, we use this iterative or back and forth process. So we would take the feedback, we would consult with people with lived experience, we would look at the literature again, go back to people with lived experience, go back to the feedback. And so it was this really, again, back and forth type of process to finally, come to the final version of the guidebook. And then once we were at that stage, we had it reviewed by a sensitivity reader. And the sensitivity reader really looks at the language that's used to see if there's bias or stereotypes or misrepresentations in the guidebook. And then we made revisions based on the feedback that we received. Next. So this just gives you a couple of pictures from this symposium. So the photo on the left, that's a group picture of the individuals who attended the symposium. Again, we had people living with dementia, care partners, health and social care providers, and researchers. And it was just a fantastic, fantastic experience. On the right, there's a photo of our lived experience panel. And that's something we do with all of our events in the dementia programs at the RIA, because that really grounds the work that we're doing, to start off by hearing directly from people with lived experience. And it just helps to sort of center people in all of the work that we do following. Next. So this past September, we finally had our final version of the guidebook, and it was launched. And again, the aim is really to support researchers and research teams that who want to engage in inclusive dementia research. And while it is quite a comprehensive book, we see it as just one tool in a research team's toolbox. So there's other resources that they can bring in and use to help complement and support the information in the guidebook. And you can scan the QR code. We'll have that, I think, again at the end as well for folks that want to take a look. Next. So when we're thinking about who, we're talking about research and research teams, but what do we mean by that? So here we mean researchers, research staff, providers that might be involved, people with lived experience and community members that are involved as well. So anybody that's involved in the research, this book is designed for them. And it's important to think about when to use the tool, or to use the guidebook. So it's important to be thinking about it before you even start, as you're just planning the project, as you're writing a grant, to continue to use it while you're engaging in the research, and then afterwards as well, especially when you're doing knowledge mobilization and sharing information back to the community. So it's not something that is just, oh, a check and to get it done. It's something that really needs to be continually considered and utilized. And then we think it's important just to highlight that this work is not easy work. It can be really hard and difficult because, we as researchers need to face our biases. And so approaching the work in a way where you're open and honest and humble is going to be really, really important in order for this to be effective and valuable to you. So now I'm going to turn it over to Navjot.
Thank you so much, Carrie. So now we'll go over the contents of the guidebook. So what will you find in this guidebook? There are 4 chapters identified by the steering committee. So the first chapter looks at the critical reflection and self-awareness. The second chapter looks at how to learn about the community. The third chapter looks at building relationships and trust with individuals in the community. And lastly, we look at the research team and the research processes. And each of these chapters provide us with information and tips, reflective questions, and resources. It is also important to kind of mention this here that yes, this is for researchers in the research process, but some of the concepts from the first 3 chapters especially can be taken and be applicable when we're working with the community as community organizations as well. Next slide, please. So for the first chapter, that is a critical reflection and self-awareness. This chapter looks at the key concepts of social location, privilege and bias, stigma and discrimination, self-awareness, the intention, assumptions, and biases, and it ends with some strategies to help research teams take action. So each person holds a unique identity that influences how they see the world, right? So we as researchers must learn to understand and acknowledge our own privilege and biases and how this can influence the work that we're conducting. And this extends to anyone. So, you could be an outsider doing research with the community, or you could be a part of the community and doing the research with your own community. These concepts are still very much valid. So from my experience, my research focus is looking at dementia in the South Asian Canadian community with people living with dementia and their care partners. And even for me, even though, yes, I am part of the community, I still had to take that step back and reflect on my privileges, right? So one of the things was that I'm born and raised in Canada. So I grew up in this culture. The gap is less for me in navigating. And I also grew up in this healthcare system, right? So my perspectives of dementia had Western influence on them. So how did that work in when I was going to talk to the community where, their perceptions of dementia may not have that Western lens to it? And one of the things that I actually struggled quite a bit was that privilege that I didn't honestly reflect on until I got to that point was the education qualifications that I had going in, right? So that created that power imbalance where they saw me as the expert, right? I was referred to as doctor, I was referred to as ma'am, which kind of took away from what I was hoping to do was go in as a learner to learn from the community. And this ties into what Granville Johnson, who's a person living with dementia and a member of her steering committee, talks about is if you want people to give you knowledge, you must be prepared to receive it. Wipe the slate clean so there is room to write down the knowledge you hear. Next slide, please. So going forward in this chapter, the next piece is the intention. So the intention must be at the top of our mind when doing research. So including people living with dementia from ethno-racial communities to research only to prevent criticism and to give the appearance of being inclusive is rarely equitable, right? This causes further harm. It's not, like Carrie said, it's not a check mark that we do, oh, will we have people from this community, right? So before even involving communities in the research, we as researchers need to take a step back and reflect on, are we doing the research for the right reasons? How is this going to impact the people living with dementia, and we should be open to listening to their values, their input, and what they want from the research. An example of this would be, say, a research team wants to look at how a community is using certain services, right? But the community, to them, it's not the usage, to them, it's accessing those services. So as researchers, it's important for us to, yes, look at the usage, but also hear the feedback from the community on how those services can be more accessible. So we are addressing their needs, not what is our agenda, which is just to look at the usage. And to help with this piece of reflection, the guidebook does provide some example reflection questions as up on the screen. So, where do you see this research going? How are you going to include and amplify the voices of people living with dementia? Similarly, moving forward, this guidebook also talks about assumptions and biases that researcher must consciously think about their privilege and what biases they hold so they can be addressed in the work that we're doing. And again, I'll say this again, this is not a check mark, right? This is not something where, oh, I took a moment, I've reflected, I've addressed my assumptions and biases, and this is done. No, this goes parallel to the work that you're doing. So it's there before you do put together the question. It's there when you're doing data collection. It's even there when you're writing up your analysis or even doing that knowledge transfer with the community. So this critical reflection and self-awareness is an ongoing process throughout the research process. And finally, this chapter provides strategies. It ends with providing strategies to help researchers and research teams take action to reduce bias. Next slide, please. And in chapter 2, we move on to how to learn about the community, right? So if we're going to engage with the community, how do we learn about them? So the key concepts we talk about in this is cultural humility, identity, intersectionality, and the history and trauma. If you can pull up the picture, please. Yeah. So the first concept that's introduced in this chapter is cultural humility. So it moves away from that cultural competency piece where when we say someone's culturally competent, it adds that thing that you know everything about a culture, right? And realistically, we can't expect someone to be competent in all the cultures, right? So cultural humility comes from that perspective that you don't know how it goes from how much you don't know about that culture. And it requires recognizing dynamics of power and privilege, exercising self-reflection and critique, and a commitment to lifelong learning. So you're going in, and I will refer to Granville, with a clean slate to learn from the community. Next slide, please. And then it's also important to understand the concepts of identity and intersectionality. So just because someone may look a certain way does not, define their identity. They have individual preferences, their intersectionality, which makes them who they are as a person, right? So I have worked with care partners from South Asian community to whom it's not necessary to have resources on Hindi and Punjabi, right? They're third, fourth, fifth generation Canadians. They speak English. To them, the culture piece might not be that important, but to them, it is important that if they're going out in the community, their community is aware of what dementia is. So awareness piece is important for them. Even I sometimes share this personal example. So my grandmom is living with dementia. She's a person living with dementia, but what is her identity is, she needs resources that are linguistically inclusive, right? She was never able to read or write English. And as her dementia progressed, she lost the little grasp she had of spoken English. But in the future, if I'm a person living with dementia, for me, being born and raised here, that linguistic piece may not be that important, right? For me, it might be the cultural piece that is more important. So it's important to understand the individual identity and also understanding that culture is rooted much deeper than observable characteristics. So in the guidebook, we have Edward T. Hall's concept of cultural iceberg, which kind of differentiates between the surface culture of what you see versus the deeper culture that is important to the person. And lastly, this chapter talks about the history and trauma. People living with dementia from diverse communities have experience with experiences of harm and trauma, which where also their strengths lie, right? Their values can coexist within these. And this then also links to in our academic world, where we often tend to go towards the deficit narrative, right? We are like, oh, well, these are the challenges faced by the community. These are the barriers faced by the community. And we often end up neglecting the strengths of the community and how can we harness them to uplift the community, and they can use it to advocate for themselves. And then lastly, this chapter ends with a few reflection questions, and the examples are up here on the screen that the researchers can use to kind of understand how much do they know about the community and how much more do they need to learn. So understanding, what are the past experiences been like of the community? We all know that in the past, harm has been perpetuated within ethno-racial communities when it comes to research, such as the Tuskegee syphilis study in Alabama. And again, coming back to what is important to the person and the community versus what is our own personal agenda as a researcher. And then moving on to chapter 3, this is one of the most critical pieces, is building that relationship and trust with individuals in the community. So some of the key concepts we talk about in this is research partner versus research participant, developing rapport and trust, as well as self-awareness and self-care for the researcher. So before we delve into these concepts, I would like to share a quote from a member of our person shared at the Dementia and Diversity Symposium. They said the researcher is becoming a part of us instead of us becoming a part of her. I can see she listens. That's how she was successful in building that trust. She came to us with her heart open. So next slide, please. So in this chapter, we build on the trauma and resilience informed research principles and practice framework. And the first one is actively seek participation of people living with dementia. So this links to that research participant versus research partner. So it's important to include people from diverse community as research partners, right? They're part of the research process from the very beginning. But it's also important to be mindful that not everyone might want to be a research partner. Life happens, they may have other commitments, but they should have that option, even if they want to stay a participant, to have that option to become a research partner. And then developing rapport and building trust. This is something that takes time, but the benefits are significant. So even when I was working on my doctoral thesis, where I looked at the experiences of South Asian Canadians living with dementia, it took me over a year of just being out in the community. So I was not there as a researcher who was looking to recruit. I was just there as Navjot, a person with lived experience. I was a care partner to my grandmother, and I just wanted to, talk to people. So I would go to health fairs. I did presentations at local community centers. I would partner with local nonprofits and do presentations in Hindi, Punjabi to really get that information to the people. And then I would sometimes just meet one-on-one with care partners and just talk to them. It was never about, well, I'm going to recruit you for this study. Would you come? It was never about that. It was about them getting to know me as a person. And it's, as researchers, we often have funding, we have deadlines, we have timelines. So it's important, that piece is important as well. But while I was doing this relationship and trust building, my work was going on in the background, right? I was going through my comps, my proposal, my ethics. But by the time the recruitment came around, it took me just over a month to recruit for all my studies because of the work that I had put in with building that trust and relationship. And it was not just about recruitment. Also, while I was collecting data, the safe space that I was able to create for the participants by building that trust and relationship, it just led to them being more open, honestly sharing their emotions and their stories, and they felt comfortable talking about things which are often stigmatized within their community, which then links to the last concept in this chapter, which is about self-awareness and self-care as researchers. So often when we're working with people who are sharing their lived experiences, they're sharing their raw emotions, their stories, their grief, their happiness, their joy. It tends to weigh down on us, right? We are listening to, say, 15, 16 participants repetitively over a time of a certain span of time. And it's not easy to, complete the interview and then shut off your mind and forget about it. It's something that stays with you. So it's important to take that time to reflect, do self-care and see and sit with your feelings. And one of the things that I experienced having worked with both the community that I'm from, as well as other communities, is when you're working with your own community, there's an additional added layer of that emotional burden, which comes from that shared culture, that shared language, right? When most of my interviews were in Hindi and Punjabi, so that those cultural nuances that were captured with the language just carried a heavier weight. And then researchers then also need to be mindful that if they're working with their own community, how do you balance being an insider versus having those pieces accessible to the outside community? So that then links back to the self-awareness piece of, reflecting on how that can be done. And then in our last chapter, we look at the research team and the research process. The key concepts that we look at here is creating a diverse research team, working collaboratively as a research team, and engaging people from community you're researching throughout the entire research process. So this chapter really focuses on ensuring the diversity is captured within the team that you're working with. People have that space to work collaboratively and share their lived experiences and strengthen the team, and to avoid that tokenism where you're having that person, like we talked about in the beginning, right, just to show that the person is there on the team or part of the team, is rarely ever equitable. And then this chapter ends with providing next slide, please. So this chapter ends with providing strategies to engage community members. So involving research partners in development of research priorities, designing inclusive and equitable strategies. So the posters that we're using for recruitment are culturally and linguistically inclusive, and collecting data in the manner that's inclusive, right? So if we know someone is not fluent in written or spoken English, then how are we making sure they're able to participate in research? And lastly, knowledge translation. So the knowledge that we gathered, how do we give that back to the community so they're able to use that? So it's very important. As researchers, we all want to publish, and that's important, but it's also important to take that back to the community in an accessible manner. And lastly, I would end with this quote by one of a person living with dementia. They said, "Involve us in creating, implementing, and assessing studies related to dementia. Our experiences hold invaluable insights that could otherwise be lost in the shuffle. I want to be part of a collaborative, participatory research environment that empowers individuals like me to contribute our knowledge and lived experiences." And I'll hand it back over to Carrie.
Thanks so much, Navjot. And we're really bringing the content to life, because I think that your examples and experience, you can, I think it's really done that for the webinar audience members. So before we wrap up for the Q&A, I just wanted to kind of bring you back to the beginning in a sense. If you remember, our original goal was to identify research priorities, and we wanted to do that using this Delphi approach. And even though I guess our path took a different turn, because we were listening to our steering committee and following their advice and their guidance, we were still able to get to this place of developing some priorities. And probably, I think it's going to end up being better than it was because of that process that we took. So maybe I'll just flip to the next part of the slide. So we have undertaken this Delphi process. We are identifying the priorities. We've gone through and got our data, and we're just doing the final analysis right now. But I can just imagine that it might be, for some researchers thinking about all of the things that we've talked about today, it might be a little bit overwhelming, and you're just wondering about it. But I think it's important to see that the process, you got to trust in the process, and following the advice and guidance of the community. And in our case, it was our steering committee, and the members of our steering committee, we're still able to make important contributions and do some of the things that we were hoping to do. It might look a little bit different than it did, than we thought it might at the beginning. And so now I think we will turn it back over to Emma.
Great. Thank you both so much. So we have a little bit of time now to answer some questions. Maybe I'll stop sharing the presentation. We've just ended with a thank you, listing our Dementia and Diversity Steering Committee for all of their contributions to this guidebook that you've both mentioned. We really could not have done it without them. So with that, we will start our Q&A portion. So if you do have a question, just a reminder, you can just type it in the Q&A box that you'll find at the bottom of your screen. So the first question that we'll start with, Carrie, is for you. What is something that you have learned as a researcher doing this process?
Yes, I've learned a lot. And yeah, reflecting on the process, yeah, I probably learned so much more than I had anticipated learning. And I guess one of the things I was thinking about, um, you know, I've heard before when you're talking to people that are from different ethno-racial communities, that idea of, being the only one in the room that looks like them. And, I guess I thought I understood what that meant. But when we had our Dementia and Diversity Symposium, and we really did have a very diverse group of individuals. And I had multiple people come up to me and speak to that issue. And I think it was really in the way that they talked about that I probably still don't fully understand, but I think I have a much deeper understanding of how important that is. That, you know, the rooms that we work with, the groups that we that we work with are reflective of the Canadian population. And so that's something that really, stood out to me in terms of what I learned in this process.
Thank you. Hey, another question just came in. Can you please share with us some ways that individuals can work with and build trust in communities as an outsider, with communities that may not wish to engage or won't engage?
Now, do you want to start out?
Yes, I can start off. So thank you so much. Yeah, that's a great question. I think one of the pieces is, as an outsider, again, it links to those assumptions and biases. I've often heard in conversations, well, why don't we just go to the religious place? Like, let's go advertise there. That's a piece of the community, right? Not everyone's gonna be there. And then do you understand the religious components of going into that place, right? If you're going into a mosque, do you understand, the steps that you have to take to come off as respectable? So I think before doing all of that, would be important to connect with someone from the community who's seen as a leader or already has trust within the community, and then working with them again, in a very humble manner that, I'm here to learn. Let me know how I can go out and work with the community. And what do you think are the best ways of connecting with the community, rather than saying, well, can you help me go to this community center or go to this gurdwara or go to this mosque? But listening to them, how we can, as an outsider, go into the community. Those are my thoughts. But Carrie, if you'd like to add to that.
Yeah, no, those are great suggestions. I think I'm picking up on one part of the question of, how do you connect with the community if they don't want to? Well, if they don't want to, that should be a red flag, because whose priorities, are you really focusing on? Yours as a researcher or the community's priorities? And it might be that there's other things that are happening within that community that are going to be, more important at a particular time than, so for example, dementia research, that I do. And so, I think in that process of meeting with someone from the community and understanding the community and connections, I think part of it is really asking that question: is this a priority for the community at this time? And if it's not, then, maybe it's, I think, moving away, and, maybe another time it would be better. But so it's really reflecting on that aspect as well.
Thank you. Yeah, and I'll just remind everyone that there um, are a lot of strategies for building trust in that chapter of the guidebook. So I would also recommend taking a look there. Okay, we have a couple more here. One question is, did any ethno-racial communities also intersect with the 2S LGBTQI plus community, especially older adults from this group?
Do you want me to start, Nav, and then?
Yeah, please go ahead.
So early on, we had discussions about diversity generally and where we wanted to focus this work, because there's, as this question suggests, there's lots of aspects of diversity, right? So ethno-racial diversity, sexual identity, age, which is funny, but you can think of younger onset dementia and more late onset dementia or different types of dementia, even geography in terms of rural, urban, remote. So there's lots of different aspects of diversity. And so we decided specifically to focus on ethno-racial diversity in this work. But as the question suggests, and as Nav talked about, in her part of the presentation, people's identity isn't just one thing. And so there may very well have been, different identities represented. We didn't specifically look for that or focus on that aspect, but it's, again, another really important thing to be thinking about. And so I think many of the concepts that are talked about in the guidebook would be applicable for any aspect of diversity, and including thinking about that intersectionality, which is, thinking about people's different identities, and how they come together and how they'll impact the experience of living with dementia, accessing healthcare services, and so on. Navjot, I don't know if you want to add something.
I just wanted to share from my experience with the South Asian community. So this is something that I talked with for my thesis, I talked with my committee about was it's also important to understand that in some ethno-racial communities, there's the stigma of dementia, but then there's also the stigma when it comes to sexual orientation. So how do you balance these two, right? So it's already you're using that time to build trust and getting them to open about talking about dementia when they get comfortable with that. And now then you're taking it one step further and asking them, well, about their sexual orientation, how does that intersect? So I think one of the steps that I took was when I did the demographic survey, I did not ask about sexual orientation just to, you know, avoid that piece coming up of, well, why do you want to know that? Or, what type of research is she doing? And this is something that I talked to care partners within the community as well. And they said, it might turn people away where they won't understand, why are you asking that? Or why is that piece important? So for my research, I left that piece out. But like Carrie said, that's an important piece, but needs to be approached in a sensitive manner, especially with that layers of being from an ethno-racial community, living with dementia, being a care partner, and then being from the LGBTQ plus community.
Thank you both. Okay, I think we have time for a couple more. One question is, how do you see this guidebook being used by researchers or students?
So I can jump in. We hit on this a little bit, but I think it's something that can be used broadly. We've been trying to do some dissemination through this webinar and through other presentations and connecting with other groups, myself, Navjot, as well as others. I think that for researchers that are doing work in this area or are new to this area, this would be a great resource, but also for students and trainees, right? To get them to start early on to think about not only working with diverse communities, but just in any of the work they're doing, to think about diversity and how do we have, more diverse representation in the research that we do, because again, it's such a huge gap, and most of the research excludes people or doesn't include people from diverse communities, and I'll say diverse broadly. So there's a lot of work to be done. There's also aspects, we're focused on dementia, but there are concepts I think, that can be used in other areas of research. And one thing that I had forgot to mention was we usually get a question about using this guide with Indigenous communities. And it's important to note that Indigenous communities do not consider themselves as ethno-racial communities. They're really a distinct group or groups. And obviously there's going to be some overlap, but there's really other processes to follow in working with Indigenous communities. So that's a question we sometimes get. Nav, I don't know if you have anything else you wanted to add.
No, thank you.
Thanks. Okay, maybe just time for one more. How do you overcome potential language barriers when interviewing enthusiastic participants who actively want to share their experiences, especially if a department does not have funding for translators?
Nav, you want to start with that one?
Yes, yeah, sure. So I think this links to that chapter 4 where we talked about the research team and the research process, right? So when you're thinking, and again, feasibility issues and what we already have in place is always going to be, there are many factors at play, but ideally, if we're looking at, say, working with the South Asian community, we know, we have done our work of understanding and knowing the community, we'll know there'll be language barriers. So in that, when we're putting together a team, making that effort, have research assistants who are from that background, who have those language skills that may be able to go in and do the interviews. And the other thing that we learned, and I think Carrie can speak to that as well from our experiences, is often difficult to do focus groups or interviews with translators. The nuances that can be captured in a direct conversation often get lost. Not saying that translators are not good way, but if possible, again, ideally there are a lot of factors at play. If possible, it would be good to have that team in place from the get-go who can support that community that we're working with.
Yeah, I completely agree with you, Navjot, in terms of the team. And as well, in another project that Navjot and I worked on, we did use translators, and it was, I guess part of it was how we use them as well. So you've got to think, so we were conducting interviews and focus groups, and the translators obviously have that expertise translating between languages, but they don't have the research expertise. And so when we were doing this process, we would say something in English, have it translated. The translator would translate it to the language, hear the feedback or the comments, and then translate it back to us. But it just didn't have the depth of information and the nuances. So that was really lacking quite a bit. And so I think, as Navjot has said, having people on your team where possible that speak the language is going to get you much better data and probably be a better process as well for people that are participating in the research.
Wonderful. Thank you. And just taking a look at the time, it looks like we might not have time to get to another question. So I'm just going to put the link to the guidebook back up in case anyone wants to scan it or copy the URL and check it out. And I'm also just going to put up Okay, we should have some poll questions coming up in just a minute, but I wanted to thank you all very much for your questions and let you know that if your question didn't get answered today, please just know that we have taken note of all the questions asked and we will try our best to address any remaining questions in a later email. You will also receive a link to view the recording of this webinar, as I mentioned, as soon as it's available. So if you do think of another question after the webinar or upon checking out the guidebook, please feel free to email. Our email is on the screen there, marep@theraa.ca. And just before we close today's session, I just want to thank Carrie and Navjot one more time for your presentation. I think this was a fantastic introduction to the guidebook, and Navjot, we appreciate you being willing to share about your personal experience as well to highlight the importance of this work. So again, the link to the website is on the screen, and we hope you take some time to check the guidebook out and share it with others who you think might be interested. And there are poll questions if you do have a few seconds to give us your feedback. We'd really appreciate it. Otherwise, have a great rest of your day, and thank you all for being here.